Welcome to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Our host is Dave Garrison from Ohio Christian University, a longtime Fortune 100 company top executive and a former U.S. Congressional Candidate from Texas. Our goal for the Faith and Liberty Talk Show is to give you an opportunity to listen to interviews and discussions with significant authorities and experts on subjects related to Christians engaging in the civil and political arena. The mission of the show is to give you real information and not sound bites that you can really use. We have a website for the show, faithandliberty.org. At this website, you can obtain more information about the show, our guests, subscribe to our newsletter, and become a friend of the show, and like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page. You can also access all of our previous shows. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If our show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. Now, let's begin today's show. Thank you for joining us.
We are so privileged today to have with us Glen Meakem, and currently he is a talk show host, an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and a whole host of other things. And Glen, you have a program on the weekends you call Glen Meakem on the Weekends. You're in Pittsburgh and a lot of other places. You want to tell us a little bit about that show?
Sure, Dave. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. I really appreciate the opportunity. I started about 5.5 years ago. I started Glen Meakem on the Weekend. And it was, I think, like you, I was very concerned about the direction of our country. I thought we were going in the wrong direction, quick towards socialism, away from God, away from competition, away from the kind of values that have made America great. And I really felt a need to do my part in educating people and just getting information out there and talking the truth about economics and about history and about politics and about entrepreneurship and about what it took to build this country. So that's what I do every weekend. It's live on Saturday mornings. It plays some markets live. It plays other markets delayed. But I'm in across the entire state of Pennsylvania. Almost every part of Pennsylvania hears my show, and then also some parts of eastern Ohio, almost all of the northern half of West Virginia. And then it has coverage into Maryland and into New Jersey as well. So it's about, we estimated it's over 100,000 people every weekend hear the show. So it's not really big, but I'm trying to do my part in spreading the message.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. And someone who's been very successful in a business career, you've been far more successful than I have. And it always never ceases to amaze me when people like yourself and me, who have had, pretty good business careers, we kind of see things maybe from a different perspective. And I appreciate you doing the show and trying to do your part in getting America on the right track. So,
well, I'll say ditto back to you.
Great. So, your business career, how has that lent you into being able to be a talk show host? How has that helped you do that, do you think?
Well, I think I have practical experience in what it takes to lead.
Imagine that.
and I actually use both of those words distinctly because I think they're different things. I got my career launched by just working really, really hard in high school, and I was very fortunate in that I was able to get into Harvard University for college, and I was one of the few conservatives at Harvard. I drifted a little bit my freshman year. I tried to be kind of liberal to moderate for about 2 weeks, trying to fit in, when I was 18 years old. And I kid about that. I don't know whether it was 2 weeks or 2 months, but by the end of my freshman year, when I was exposed to so many liberals in the Boston area and at Harvard, and I love Harvard, it's a great university, but and there were other conservatives. In fact, the smartest, best students, and I majored in political science. I took a lot of economics, a lot of history, a lot of political science, and some science and other topics, math and some other things too. But the best and brightest students in my classes were conservatives like me. And I tell you what, by my sophomore year, I was solidly conservative on the path. And I did well. I also had an Army ROTC scholarship, so I was training to be a military officer. And I got out of college, and I was in the Army briefly. Was a reserve officer in the Army, so I was in the Army, and then I went right into business after that, and I was in marketing for Kraft General Foods and learned a lot about how to get a message out and also how to manage things. And I also learned some things about how big bureaucracies don't function very well when I was at Kraft, because it's a wonderful company, but it's a big dysfunctional bureaucracy. I've talked about that publicly before. The Army, of course, is a great institution as well that's done great things for our country in World War II and in many other battles over time, the Gulf War, et cetera. But it's a big dysfunctional bureaucracy as well as most government entities are. And so as I went through my career, I tell my children, I have 5 kids, my wife and I, we've been married almost 25 years, and we have 5 children, and I often tell my kids that as you're having different experiences in school, in work, et cetera, you need in sports with different coaches. This is a big issue with my sons. Sometimes you have a good coach, sometimes you have a bad coach, and you need to learn through the positive experiences. And when you have a great mentor, leader, coach, you learn to emulate them. And when you have a bad or a mediocre coach or leader, you learn by negative example things to avoid. And so through my career at Kraft and in the Army, I was after I was at Kraft, I got married, I went to business school, I went back to Harvard for my MBA, and during my MBA, I had a great experience. I learned a tremendous amount at Harvard Business School, and then in the middle, I had to go back in the Army for the Gulf War. I volunteered and went back, and I served in the Gulf War, and in all my Army experiences, I had both wonderful leaders and people I'm still in touch with, and who I learned a tremendous amount from on the positive side, and tremendous experience, training in leadership and management in the Army. I also had negative experiences where I learned some things to avoid. And so and then of course the big change for me is I got out of business school and I went to the consulting firm McKinsey & Company, the global consulting firm. I'm sure some listeners have heard of McKinsey. That's a whole tremendous entrepreneurial story, is the story of the firm McKinsey. It's been around for 80 years now. But I was there, and I learned a tremendous amount there as well, and then I left there, went to GE briefly, and then I started a company that you're familiar with, Dave, called Freemarkets. And what happened was I was at McKinsey and then GE, and I saw the way corporations were purchasing, and I thought that there was a more efficient, better way to find good suppliers and find the right price and the right quality of supply for different industrial inputs. And I also became very familiar with the Internet. This is in the mid-'90s. And so I started a company where we would automate the request for proposal, request for quote, and negotiation process that large industrial buyers go through with their suppliers, and then automate that using the Internet and create online requests for quote, online requests for proposals, and then use automated negotiating tactics, including online downward price auctions that basically drove market prices, free market prices, in areas where there really hadn't been good price visibility before, and you really didn't know whether you were getting a fair price or not. So this free market approach led to the name Freemarkets, and it created a lot of savings and efficiency for large industrial buyers, and gave access to business for a lot of very efficient good suppliers as well. And that was a big part of my business experience. And then we were really creating a free market process to do industrial sourcing, industrial purchasing.
Well, doesn't that sound greedy? You knew I was going there eventually.
It's funny. In my view, and we talked before that we started the interview here, the recording. I am an evangelical Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I'm not secretive about that. I am a public Christian, and I find that the Bible is really a book about love and compassion and faith, and having to have faith in our Lord and Savior. It's also a book about personal standards and the kind of life you should lead if you have that faith. And it's also a book about freedom. God gives us the freedom to succeed or the freedom to fail. He gives us the freedom to believe or the freedom not to believe. And if you looked at the Old Testament, God could have just dictated to the state of Israel. He could have dictated that, hey, you're always going to be obedient to me. But he didn't. He gave the people of Israel the freedom to go their own way. And he gives Christians the freedom to go their own way. And so I think that the Bible is very, very, very consistent with this notion of freedom and God's gift of freedom. And when you really get down to it, what is the driving force that has lifted humanity out of just utter, terrible, grinding poverty and disease and war and all the violence and pillaging. And you think about, I read a lot of history. If you read the way the world was in 1500
Right.
or 1200 or 1000 AD, this is not that long ago in the big scope. And the world was a terrible place. It was violent. And even look back to 1900, the average life expectancy of an American here in our country 114 years ago was only about 45 years.
And even less during the founding of the
114
country.
years ago, the odds are we'd be dead.
Yeah.
And what has lifted people out? It's free market competition. It's the fact that you and I have the freedom to go create things and lead things and build things, and we don't have to ask anybody's permission to do it. That freedom, that's blessed in the Bible. That's consistent with Christianity.
I agree wholeheartedly. We've had David Barton, we've had Jay Richards, and any number of other guests, Star Parker, who have really criticized some of the government policies and principles that have taken away that. So do you feel like a lot of our liberty is being abridged, or is it just a perception of Christians and conservatives?
No, being a business person, and this gets back to your original question about the radio, and I'm sorry I was droning on so long, but the fact is that I think because I've had significant business experience, both leading and trying to lead and inspire people, and also managing through all the difficulties, all the trouble of running a business, I can bring, and I do bring, like yourself, a perspective that people who haven't had that experience just don't bring to communicating what it's like in the economy.
Do you find most politicians don't appreciate that understanding, or?
Yes, I think that's part of the problem. There's a lot of problems, but yes, we're losing our freedom. We are less. You look at Obamacare, you look at the fact that the government is now forcing people off of their insurance policies. I mean, think about that word. The government is forcing people, millions of people, to lose the insurance policy they had previously were happy with, they had previously negotiated in the free market, and the government's forcing those to change. That's not freedom, that's compulsion.
I never thought I would see something like that. In my lifetime, I couldn't imagine the American federal government mandating that we had to buy a product.
I agree. To me, it was, I think that John Roberts made a terrible decision when in the Supreme Court.
And supposedly he changed his mind in the last 24 hours, that decision, too.
Yeah. I mean, that opinion, the Supreme Court decision was a total, bend over backwards contortion to try to find a way to make Obama, to try to make this fact that the government is forcing Americans to make a commercial decision. They had to screw themselves into knots in order to try to make that constitutional, and it's a terrible, terrible abridgment of our freedom.
We want to welcome a new and very important sponsor to our show, Compassion International. My wife and I have sponsored a child through Compassion International for the last 8 years. Please also consider sponsoring a child, where in Jesus' name you will give a child an opportunity to receive an education, to be healthy, to develop self-confidence and social skills, and more importantly, learn about Jesus. Wouldn't this be a wonderful thing to do at Christmas? Please check out our website, faithandliberty.org, to sponsor a child, or call Compassion International at 877-496-7016. That's 877-496-7016.
Michael W. Smith for Compassion.
I cannot begin to tell you how crazy I am about Compassion. I don't get involved in too many things, but I'll never forget 13 years ago I got asked to be involved with Compassion. And if I'm not mistaken, I think my answer was no, because I didn't know anything about them. But I said, I'll tell you what I'd love to do. I would love to sponsor a child, and then I would like to go see what you do. I'll never forget my first trip to Ecuador. It was just life-changing. I don't know if you've ever been to a third world country, but at some point, if you ever have a chance to go, it will change your life. But I went and saw Compassion's work and what they did nutritionally for the kids and then educationally. And then the most important thing was that they shared the gospel with these kids. And I'm convinced that there's hundreds of thousands of kids who have come to know Christ in a personal way through Compassion sponsorship program.
To sponsor a child or to learn more, call Compassion now, toll free 877-496-7016. That's 877-496-7016.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Does it seem like today's culture is racing towards the edge of a cliff? Choosing an educational institution is like choosing a winning race car. Ohio Christian is a values-driven university, preparing servant leaders to engage their world. Graduates excel in leadership. Just ask our 5-time New York Times best-selling author, Dr. John Maxwell. If you're looking to get on course, come enter the race with us. We're now enrolling for the fall semester, so enroll today at www.ohiochristian.edu or call 1-877-7-OCU now.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
Well, kind of going back to your military career, what did the military career, and by the way, thank you for your service, having been a top executive at USAA. Our slogan was, we know what it means to serve, and we appreciate your service. But what lessons did you think you picked up from that, both as a believer, as a business person, and as a conservative?
Well, there's so many lessons I learned in the military, but two that come to mind very clearly are, number one, leading by example. And I think that's a Christian principle. You know, it's to walk the walk, not just to talk the talk.
Yeah, the servant leader.
Yes. It's a real part of being a biblical servant leader is to lead by example. Absolutely. There's another thing though that's even more profound and even I think more important biblically, which is that I remember distinctly. I was 19 years old. I was 20 years old in my first boot camp, and it was in summer after my sophomore year of college at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And it was hot, and we were doing all kinds of different training and long field marches, and a lot of time on the rifle range, learning to shoot our M16s well, and all kinds of leadership training and drill. And I tell you what, it's funny. A friend of mine who is also an Army veteran said that the great thing about boot camps is they're like Outward Bound with guns. It's just you get paid here. If you're 18 years old or 16 years old and your parents want to shape you up and have you learn about the outdoors, they pay you to send you to Outward Bound, and you go camp in the woods. You go to the Army or you go to the Marine Corps, and they actually pay you to go camp in the woods and hike around in the woods, and except you get to shoot guns too. It's fabulous. But it's Outward Bound with guns. But anyway, I really enjoyed boot camp. But I was in this first boot camp, and I learned this. I was taught this many times in the military. But we're in this leadership class, and nobody teaches leadership the way the military does. The U.S. military does a great job. And they said, great leaders are great followers. And I heard that, 20-year-old Glenn. I heard that, and I said, no. I'm a leader. And leaders, this is what I'm thinking to myself. Leaders don't follow. Leaders lead. I'm a leader. I've always been a leader. I'm a born leader, I'm thinking to myself. And I was. God blessed me with leadership ability. There's no doubt. I've told members of my family and members of my church, I believe I have the spiritual gift of leadership, and that's a gift. But
yes, it is.
Right. But it's funny because I'm hearing this saying, I'm a leader. I'm not a follower. But then they taught us more, and they taught us not only that day in the lecture, but over time and through example. And they explained that if you're a lieutenant and you're in command of say 30 men in an infantry platoon. Well, you're a leader. You're a leader of those men. You're responsible for them. But you also have to follow your company commander, your captain. And in order to be and if you need to follow him and support him with your subordinates. And the cardinal sin, like the worst thing you can do as a leader, is disparage your leader. So if you're that lieutenant in charge of these 30 men, and you start saying negative things about the company commander, about your captain, then all your men are going to distrust you. You ruin the credibility of the chain of command. So to be a great lieutenant, to be a great platoon leader, you got to be a great follower of your company commander. Now, what does that mean? That means when you're asked for an opinion, and there's a group meeting, the company commander's having a meeting trying to determine, what do we do? Well, you owe it to him or her to give your honest opinion. But then once a decision's been made, you also have to execute that decision. Unless there's another wrinkle there, unless it's in a legal order, in which case if it's in a legal order, which is very rare, then you have a moral and ethical obligation to disobey the order if it's illegal. But that would be an extreme rare situation. But here's the point: is that to be a great leader, you got to be a great follower too. Now that's we're talking about the platoon level, the company level, kind of the junior level of the Army here, right? Now let's take that to the Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
I was hoping you'd go there.
Yeah. Why was George Washington such a great leader as the father of our country, as the commander-in-chief of the military, as the first president of the country. Well, you know the famous story that he gave up power multiple times. You know, at the end of the Revolutionary War, here he was the commanding general. He was the first, victorious general, and he was the first victorious general in 2,000 years of human history to actually not seize power as a dictator. He gave up. He literally, even though Congress never gave him enough food, never gave him enough material, he, as the commanding general of the army, stayed under the authority of Congress. He was both a leader of all his men and a follower of Congress. And at the end of the war, he gave back his commission and went home to Mount Vernon.
He led by example, because we know how many reports there were of bullets, going through his jackets and everything else, because he led his men. Now, fast forward, Glenn, to our current commander-in-chief. What lessons that you've learned over your career would you apply to either the failures or the pluses? Right.
Well, and that's the point, is that so a guy like Washington was under the authority of Congress, and then also as president, he was under the authority of God. The way he behaved and acted, he didn't act like he was the ultimate dictator leader. He acted like he was a man who was a leader, but under greater authority, and that gave him tremendous credibility. A man like Ronald Reagan behaved the same way. He was the president of the United States in this huge, august position, and yet he acted that he was under authority, under spiritual authority, under ethical authority. You look at Barack Obama as a man and as president, he acts like he's under nobody's authority. And that's one reason so many of us distrust him, because he does not act like a leader who's accountable to anybody.
But he says he's doing all this for the people.
Does it? That's what dictators have said for thousands of years.
Gee, don't hold back, Glenn.
I don't hold back.
No, I appreciate that.
They call me in promoting my radio show, they call me the free-speaking, truth-telling guardian of the American way.
There you go. Well, do you think that a lot of Christians have lost their voice because they haven't spoken up, particularly in the last 50 years?
I think, it's funny. I think many Christians do speak up, but I think that we have to learn. See, one of the really difficult things of American history is that there are painful chapters. There are painful things that, as great as our country, we have to start using a new language, a new way of speaking about our history, and that's something like this. We have a great history. We're the first constitutional republic, we're the, however you want to call it, but we're the first constitutional democracy in the history of mankind. We're the longest living regime right now. Our country, our Constitution's been in place for over 230 years. We're the first case of democracy. We've been this beacon of, as Ronald Reagan always said, we've been this beacon of light, this shining city on the hill, as an example of liberty and rule of law and freedom for humanity. And we've had, and one of the key reasons we've been so successful economically is because we have that freedom, because you can start a business and act on an idea and create value. And, we have all that, and yet we also have the legacy of slavery. And we have some negative things that have happened in our history, too. And what the left does is they try to use the negative parts of our history to indict the entire history. I'll say that again. What the left tries to do is they try to use the negative parts of our history to indict the whole history. And so what we as Christians, as Americans, and as Christian Americans need to do is speak in a way where we're sensitive to the negative parts of our history. We cannot be perceived as racist in any way. We cannot be perceived as anti-Semitic in any way, because the left will use any indication of that as to try to sweep up the negative past and indict the positive past and the positive future. So we need to use a language where we're sensitive to the concerns of various people and the more negative parts of our history, but celebrate and promote the positive parts of our history. And I think if we can learn that language, then we can speak and shout from the rooftops, and we can, and that's what I try to do. I try to shout from the rooftops about our freedom and about economic competition, economic free markets, capitalism, these things that make us successful and that make lives worth living on this earth, but in a way where I try to be sensitive, and I try not to say anything that would be perceived as negative that the left could use against people like me. See what I'm saying?
Oh, I see it perfectly, but I think they own the media. I think they own a lot of the channels, and they are very adept at changing the language and using the words, like we're anti-abortion, but they're pro-choice, you see.
Right.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Frank Lutz. He wrote the book Words That Work. You often see him on Fox News where he's doing the panels. And in his book, one of his principles, which I think you were just talking about, is we really do need to own the language, be very astute with our language. Conservatives tend to speak plainly and simply, and as a result, we often are misquoted and abused because of that. But I appreciate that, because you brought up slavery. People look back on our history, and if you were a liberal, they'd tell you that's the way it is that everybody in America was for slavery. There was a huge divide, even at the founding of our nation. It was a big debate, and yet, that's never really recognized. Do they talk about the fact that the Republican Party was primarily founded because they were anti-slavery? No, they don't talk about that sort of stuff. So,
yeah.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you're enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
What do you think are the most pressing issues in America right now as you sit where you sit?
Well, I think the number one issue is the fact that our government has grown way beyond what it should be under our Constitution. So our government has become this large administrative state with rolling budgets that can't be changed every year by Congress. Literally, they do continuing resolutions because they don't pass budgets anymore. And the large administrative state just gobbles up more and more of the economy every year. And that is what's resulting in this massive, massive debt and also these massive unfunded liabilities. We have just it's not a topic politicians want to talk about, but the fact of the matter is that right now the Social Security unfunded liability is something like $20 to $25 trillion. The Medicaid unfunded liability is even more. It's something like $30 trillion. And the Medicare unfunded liability is the big daddy of them all. It's something like over $35 trillion. And that's all on top of the $17 trillion of debt we have. And every year that goes by, this huge administrative state just gets bigger and bigger, and all the debts and the unfunded liabilities keep getting larger. And that cannot go on forever. It can't.
And I talked to somebody, I can't remember who it was that I interviewed, but he said, the numbers are so big that people can't perceive them, so they can't relate to them. So as a result, it doesn't really connect. And we've seen that in some recent elections, particularly 2012, when all that stuff was visible. One of my favorite quotes, I'll read it to you, and I know you've heard it, but I wanted to share it with the listeners. The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, public debt should be reduced, the arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and the assistance to foreign land should be curtailed lest Rome become bankrupt. People must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance. And that was Cicero in 55 BC. These problems have been around for many, many years, over 2,000 years and plus. Why is it you think that governments don't learn this lesson and they head towards bankruptcy or some sort of other terrible catastrophe? if history is well known.
I just heard a speech today at lunchtime by Dr. Dick Jewell, who's the president of Grove City College.
Sure.
And you may know his name in Grove City College. Mm-hmm. He accurately pointed out that we're fallen individuals.
Yeah.
This is not a perfect world. It's a fallen world. That's also a biblical concept, of course, that explains things perfectly. It's a fallen world. And so people, it's not just governments, it's the people who elect them and the people who support them are prone to make these same mistakes over and again. And, I think one of the other big problems we have is this problem of dependency. Now, it's funny, it's a biblical concept that we should have we should have compassion for the poor, and we should try to help the poor. It's also a direct quote from Jesus that there will always be poor. There's no way human society on this earth will ever be perfect enough that there won't be poor people. There will always be poor people. And there will always be people with disabilities and challenges where they won't be able to support themselves. But what is, I think, a very, very unbiblical approach is to have government policies that actually make more people poor. And that, unfortunately, is what's gone on here over the last 40 or 50 years now in America, is we've had these sort of socialist-leaning policies that have created a real almost disease in society where more and more people have gotten wrapped up in behaviors which are making them poor and making them dependent. And it's clearly not God's plan for half the population to be born out of wedlock, as an example. And for the government to have policies, tax policies, welfare policies, etc., that actually encourage people to be born out of wedlock is a really, really anti-Christian thing, which forces, and not just Christian, anti-Judeo-Christian thing that forces more and more people into poverty. And it's just, so we have got to get a handle on this dependence issue, because the more people we have who are dependent, the more people vote for these unsustainable spending policies, and the more people who are not producing and helping society be strong, but are in fact taking living off the society and making it weak. So I'd say that an awareness of this debt and this just massively growing administrative state is one big problem. But the second big problem that's related is this growing dependency, which we need to curtail. We need to turn around.
Well, one of the things that concerns me a lot, and a lot of the guests we've had on the show, and this university, Ohio Christian University, we're focused on a Christian worldview, as you've just espoused, which is fantastic. Yet, when you look at the media, you look at most liberals, you look at academic elitists or elites, they don't have the same worldview and think our worldview is really cockeyed. So how do we profess a Christian worldview in this current culture and make an impact with it from your perspective?
Yeah, and I don't have a perfect answer, but I know what I'm trying to do with my communications. It's having this kind of conversation. And right. With my own children, it's talking about the practical, what works in this world. Christianity is not just pie in the sky. It's unfortunately, my father passed away this year, and
I'm sorry.
It was my first. Thank you. It was the first time in my life where I've had a close family member pass away, and he was in my arms when he died, and I saw that, and I felt that, and it's let's put it this way: I don't know how people who don't have faith, who don't believe in heaven, who don't have faith in Jesus, I don't know how they deal with it, because it's so shocking to lose somebody that way and to see them die. Dying is not pretty; it's not pleasant. It's not, but it's a beautiful thing if you know that, hey, this poor, sick, dying person is going to be reborn. They're going to they have a future in heaven. If you know that, then you can accept it. But if you didn't know that, how could you accept it? So to me it's practical, and it's practical at that moment at the end of life. It's very practical. But then as a teenager, when you're making choices, if you choose to go out with the wrong guy and you get yourself pregnant. Now again, every life is blessed. God has His will, but practically that has huge consequences. If you choose not to work hard, if you choose to be lazy and not get an education, that has consequences, negative consequences. And so, whereas if you have these kind of Judeo-Christian values of hard work and honesty and diligence and faithfulness and loyalty and delayed gratification. The list goes on and on. But if all these biblical traits, if you have those, it leads to practical success. So, fine, live like the Kardashians. And
you had to say that name, didn't you?
Right. Have the ups and downs, and I guess some people want to live that lifestyle. But the fact of the matter is, it's not going to work. For 99% of us, it's in a practical way, it's going to lead to failure. And the biblical path is really a path to success in this world. And I know that there's a fine line there, because you don't want to stress that too much, because salvation is a lot more important than success in this world. But on the other hand, it sure is important to not starve, and it sure is important to win wars. I bring it down to war, because think about World War II was not that long ago either. And had we been I fear that, look at the rise of China, look at the rise of radical Islam and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I look to the future and I say, you know what? At the beginning of the 20th century, nobody thought war. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of World War I. Read the books about the first decade of the 20th century. No one thought war was possible. We had all this new technology. We had cars. We had aeroplanes. We had sewing machines. We had
bombs that you could drop from a plane, even.
Yeah, we had power we had street lights and electric power in homes in 1910. We had all that stuff. Our great grandparents did. And how could modern people possibly go to war? Well, guess what? It erupted into a massive war in 1914. Think about where we are today in 2013. We have the internet. We have space travel. We have all this stuff. We couldn't possibly have war, except we have the Taliban, and we have Al-Qaeda, and we have radical Islam, and we have a rising China. And you know what? You know what happens when fortunately, my grandparents' age, our grandparents fought and won World War II, and we weren't under Nazi rule, right? But can you imagine what it would have been like if we had lost that war? And if we are weak, if people are more concerned about the welfare checks they're getting from the government than the amount they're going to produce to contribute to society, if we have a majority of people more concerned about their checks and less concerned about contributing and producing, then you know what? When the next war comes along, and it will come along, I've studied enough history to know it will happen someday. We'll
will. Where are you on that scale of pessimism and optimism about the nation's future?
I'm optimistic.
Why?
Here's why. Ronald Reagan said it, that freedom, the battle for freedom, has to be won in every generation. That's not a direct quote, but that's essentially what we said.
That's essentially
and other people have said that many times over. Winston Churchill said that God blesses widows, orphans in the United States of America. I think Winston Churchill or others have also said that our current system is terribly flawed, but it's the best in the world. In essence. Here's where I come down on this, is that I believe that we, the American people, with the freedom we still have the ability to turn this around. And I look back on history. You look back at 1929, 30, 31, 32, where we were at much greater risk of socialist takeover then than we are now. We turned it around. Our grandparents turned it around. I believe that we will turn it around, because freedom is a very powerful thing. When individual freedom, when people have the freedom to make decisions and take care of their own families and defend their own families and build their own businesses and start their own political movements, it's a very, very powerful thing. And write their own books and have their own radio shows. It's a very powerful thing. So I believe that people like you and I and all the great people you interview, and Dave and many others who care enough about our country and our world to communicate, to learn and study and then communicate, I think that we collectively will turn it around. I learned something when I was in the Gulf War. I was a lieutenant. I was in command of a combat engineer platoon. I was 26, and then I turned 27 when I was over there. I learned that despite I remember growing up and there'd be Audie Murphy in a war movie, in a World War II war movie.
Sure.
He's a big hero and stuff. Well,
right.
I learned in a real war there are no real heroes. It's a huge collective effort. Everybody has to do their little part. If nobody does their part, if everybody turns tail and runs, then you lose. But if everybody does their part and is courageous and brave and does their job under the stress of war, then you win. And that means everybody from the frontline infantry soldier or tank commander to the logistics people in the back, everybody through the whole chain. If everybody does their job and everybody's courageous and everybody is part of the team, you can win. It's a massive team effort. I think that's the way we have to look at turning America around right now, is that I can't do it alone. You can't do it alone. It's a massive team effort, and we all have to do our part. And if we do that, we can turn this around, and I believe we will.
Rebecca St. James for Compassion.
I think one of the big issues that I see in my own life, and I just see in young people, is this common selfishness. It's a complete battle to not live for self, because everything is saying, Rebecca, if it makes you feel good, do that. Please yourself. The culture is encouraging that in such a huge way. And I think compassion is an amazing way that we can be encouraged to live beyond ourselves. It's not about us, It's not about how we feel. It's more about serving Him and showing His love to a hurting world. And through compassion, you really actually get to see the need. Here is a huge need, and I can make a difference one child at a time.
To sponsor a child or to learn more, call Compassion now, toll free 877-496-7016. That's 877-496-7016.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Does it seem like today's culture is racing towards the edge of a cliff? Choosing an educational institution is like choosing a winning race car. Ohio Christian is a values-driven university, preparing servant leaders to engage their world. Graduates excel in leadership. Just ask our 5-time New York Times best-selling author, Dr. John Maxwell. If you're looking to get on course, come enter the race with us. We're now enrolling for the fall semester, so enroll today at www.ohiochristian.edu or call 1-877-7-OCU now.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
One of the people I interviewed who was more pessimistic, one of the things that they cite is that 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7 people work for the federal government. When you add the maybe more than 70 million people who are on some sort of government assistance, welfare of some form or fashion, you look at the academic elitists, the media, the sheer numbers that you put together there in that area tend to make us think that it's going to be really hard to turn it around because they keep electing people like President Obama.
Yeah, but the good news is the truth is a powerful thing, and socialism doesn't work. Going down into authoritarian, you think about how authoritarian this administration is, the Obama administration. They hide information. They constantly lie. They prevent investigations of what happened. They have executive orders to pass law. They get laws passed through Congress, and then they change the law by executive fiat. These are not constitutional Republican kinds of freedom sort of constitutional rule of law behaviors. These are authoritarian dictatorial behaviors. That's what we're facing. But the thing is that it never works. You might have a lot of people vote for it for this election cycle or the next 5, but it never works.
That's
and as long
exactly
as there are
the
those
point.
who are courageous enough to stand up against it and speak against it and take action against it, eventually people will see that it doesn't work. I mean, the truth is authoritarianism doesn't work. The truth is socialism doesn't work. And that reality that truth will bubble to the surface. And I think there are enough Americans who will continue to speak the truth and turn it around. I really do. I don't believe we should be pessimistic. I think we should be optimistic, and that's why I do. Even if I was pessimistic, I wouldn't do my radio show I wouldn't work 6 days a week. I work 6. I've been very successful, and I've got a lot of money, and I've done very, very well. And I work 6 days a week. Why? Because I'm optimistic, and because I want to contribute, and I think that's God's will for me. So I do my radio. I work Friday nights, and I work Saturday morning, and I do my radio show.
Well,
all week long, all week long I work on my new business. We'll have to talk about that in a minute too. But I started.
Yeah, forever.com, I think it is. Well, go ahead and talk about that, and then I'll tell you kind of what some of our approaches with the students that seem to be successful. But go ahead.
Oh, I'd love to hear about that. Yeah. So real quick on forever.com. So I realized, this is back almost 2 years ago now, or in early 2012, I realized that I had no play. My family history is really important to me. The legacy of what my parents have done, what my grandparents, who are now all passed away, were able to accomplish. I come from very humble roots. My grandfather my dad's dad was an orphan. Grew up in a Catholic orphanage in Newark, New Jersey in the 19-teens and early 20s. And then he got out of there and he was able to get a rudimentary education and lift himself up and get into the middle class. And then my dad got an education, and it's a long story. But the bottom line is that my heritage is important to me, and what the legacy of those people who came before is important to me, and passing on my own beliefs and my own key memories is important to me as well. And I tell people, if you're a Christian, you believe in God, God knows everything about you. He knows every picture of your life. He knows everything you've said. You don't need to curate your life for God. He knows what you're all about. But your grandchildren don't. Unless you save those key photos and those things you wrote and the radio shows you recorded or whatever it is, unless you save those things, your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren won't know what you believed, won't know how you were successful, won't know about entrepreneurship, won't know about your Christian faith. They won't know any of these things. So the only way you can make it, so basically, how do you save the key things? And I realized, wow, we needed a solution where you didn't just store stuff on the internet in the cloud on a social networking site like Facebook, where they own everything you upload, and then they as soon as you die, or you get old and sick and you're no longer valuable to advertisers, they shut you off. Or Dropbox, where it's great to save files and homework and business papers and stuff, but as soon as you stop paying your bill, they shut you off. And they don't even think about digital rights or what rights you have long term. I realized that there was a need for a service that said, hey, if you want to save your really valuable photographs, the things that are important to you, the things about your grandparents, your parents, yourself, your photographs, your video, your writing, your documents, your legal documents, your statements of faith, your audio files, whatever it is, the things that are important to you, if you want to save those and share those with your family, not just today, but in the future, there need to be a service where somebody would provide a storage site, a storage and sharing site that was permanent, where you could store things and have them be shared with friends and family, not just today, but well into the future. So I realized, and I did the research, there was no offering like that, and so I came up with the idea of forever.com, and I was able to buy the domain forever.com. We were able to raise a lot of money, put together a business plan, raise a lot of money, build a team, build some fabulous software. And just this fall, in the fall of 2013, we went live with forever.com. And it's a place now on the internet where you can save and share your key memories permanently. So when you buy storage with us, you don't pay every month, or you don't give away your rights to things and have advertisers pummel you with advertisements, and
or the NSA look through your stuff.
I'm sorry, say again.
Or the NSA looking through your stuff.
Our stuff is triple backed up and encrypted. So it's as secure as it's bank level security. Now, the truth is,
how do you make it permanent?
Yeah, probably the NSA could penetrate your, and look at photos of your pictures, of your grandparents, and listen to old recordings of your radio show and stuff. They probably could, if they put all their evil intent, focused on you. But I think the reality is the kind of things that are important to each family are not things that the government is all that interested in.
Well, I'm very concerned, Glenn, about Facebook and Twitter and some of these things, particularly as I see young people use it, and I constantly warn them that whatever you put out there, it's there, and it can be there for a very long time. You don't want a future employer seeing some of those things. When you're younger, your discretion is not always what it ought to be, and you need to be really careful of those things. And where forever.com is as you've described, it's some place to permanently store kind of your heritage and your legacy. But how do you make it permanent? Because what happens if your firm goes bankrupt, for instance?
What happens is when people buy, we call them permanent social gigabytes, so permanent social storage with us, the money they pay for that, each permanent social gigabyte, goes into the Forever Guarantee Fund, which is an endowment which already has well over $1 million in it. And basically that endowment is invested across a whole set of investments globally, stocks, bonds, just like a big university endowment. or a big pension fund, and it produces income every year, and that income pays for the actual storage and bandwidth for sharing in that year. So we've established that fund. It's a restricted fund. It can't be legally
rated
penetrated by anybody, and it's there to fund that storage and sharing out into the future. We offer people, a 100-year. Basically the guarantee is people who store their key memories, their key photos and documents and things and video with us. We guarantee their lifetime plus 100 years, but the goal is actually many, many centuries. The goal is thousands of years.
Wow, that's an excellent service.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's an excellent service, and the reason I kind of pushed you more on it is because I wanted the listeners to see how an entrepreneur thinks. And it's something that we do a lot with the students is thinking beyond the first level. There's a famous test out there. It's called the cognitive reflective test. It's got 3 questions. And when you ask the three questions, and I'll just tell you what one of them is, and that is if a ball and a bat cost $1.10 and the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Well, most people immediately jump to, well, the bat must be $1 and the ball $1.10. Well, that doesn't make it right. It's 95 cents for the bat, and it's 5 cents for the ball and $1.05 for the bat. All right,
that's right.
Or the math doesn't work out. And this is something that I've seen in entrepreneurs like you over and over again. You don't just see and you don't just jump to the first conclusion. You go further beyond. Now, I'm going to draw that back then to conservatism. I have often thought that conservatives are more deeply thinking about these subjects, about anything. What's your thought?
It actually goes back to what I said about my experience a long time ago when I went to school at Harvard. I think the best students in my classes, bar none, in the political science and the economics courses at Harvard, at liberal Harvard, the minority of us who were conservatives, we may have only been 30%. It wasn't 2%. It might have been 30%, 35%. And I think the best students were always the conservatives because frankly, it's hard to – you can make these emotional, ideological arguments in favor of socialism and in favor of communism and in favor of liberalism. But when you look at facts and present facts, you really can't make good arguments for those things. You can make great arguments for free market capitalism, free market economics. You can make great arguments for liberty, individual liberty. You really can't make good arguments based on facts for liberalism or for socialism.
When a conservative looks at welfare and they go further, they realize that helping people can also cause them to not help themselves when they could help themselves.
Yes.
But at first blush, you say, well, we want to help people. And what kind of people are we that don't want to help people? Well, sometimes it's not the very best thing to do for people. And that takes more than, as you pointed out, the ideological arguments. Now, I know we're short of time here, and I wanted to get to 2 of my favorite questions. And the first one would be, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it over this nation, what are some of the things that you would fix right away with that magic wand?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is I would fix dependency. I would enable, with that magic wand, I would sprinkle dust on everybody, and everybody who was physically and mentally able to get an education and have a job, they would get the education and have a job that they were capable of doing, and they would not be dependent. Another thing I would fix, here this is even more
because
concrete.
that makes them free.
That makes them free. That makes them free,
Right.
And that makes them contribute.
Right.
And that gives them a quality of life where they have self-worth. And they standing on your own 2 feet, you have self-worth. If you're dependent, it's very difficult. Life is very long and very crushing, very, very difficult if you're dependent. Here's another thing. I would change our culture around education. One thing, this may be controversial, but I'll say I'm not afraid of controversy. One thing that I have noticed, I noticed as a child, I went to both public and private school, and I've seen this and confirmed it with young people throughout my life. I'm 49, so I'm in the middle of my life, but I'm old enough to have experienced a lot. And one thing that is so ironic to me is that the key when you look at the big databases, level of education and income are almost perfectly correlated in our society. So basically, the more education you have, this is big broad groups of people, the more income you earn. Now you go to our schools, go to any public middle school or high school in our country, and I don't care whether you go in the urban centers or you go to suburbs, what you find is the same thing. You might find different degrees, but it is uncool to be smart in America. The 15-year-old or the 13-year-old or the 11-year-old who's going to school every day, trying to work hard, trying to get an education, and trying to make something of themselves is uncool. And they are chastised, they are bullied, they are called all kinds of names. And this is true. There are little white children and little black children and little Asian children and little Hispanic children who all suffer from this. It's across all lines. And if I could wave a wand over one thing, that would be very concrete, it would be to make being smart, make working hard in school, being the good kid who tries to get ahead, make that the cool thing, and make being lazy and being disrespectful and being disruptive in school, make that the uncool thing that everybody wants to stop.
Well, this is one of the reasons I'm at Ohio Christian University, because of the encouragement of those things. Yet I see students that'll come in from the public schools, and a lot of times, and unfortunately with our program, they can't hide because we get to know all our students very well. And I'll find these absolutely brilliant students who are trying to not let others realize how brilliant they are. And so we try to encourage that and explain to them and celebrate that. So I appreciate that. And I know you're a trustee of a university, and I forget which one is it.
I used to be. I'm a former trustee of Carnegie Mellon University.
Oh, yeah, that little unknown school there in Pittsburgh.
Unknown school here in Pittsburgh.
Right. Well,
yeah,
Glenn,
I was a trustee there for 7 or 8 years.
Again, I know we're pretty much out of time. And Glenn, I again want to thank you for your service in the military. Thank you for being an entrepreneur as a believer who practices your principles. I love some of the things that you're saying, particularly because I'm always telling our students here at Ohio Christian that, as it says in Colossians 3, whatever your task, do it heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. And I see that as evidenced in your life, and it's one of the main reasons I wanted to interview you. And I just appreciate what you're doing there, and we're of a like mind in our little talk shows here, and hopefully the listeners will see that what is true works. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Well, have a great day.
On behalf of our host, Dave Garrison, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show today. For additional information about the show, please go to faithandliberty.org, where you can access previous shows, like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page, and access other resources. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If the show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. The opinions and comments represent the views of our speakers and may or may not represent the views of Ohio Christian University. May God bless you, and thank you for listening to our show.